Hi everyone, I'm Steve Warrington from Up.ai and welcome and thank you for joining today. Today we're going to be exploring new research we've commissioned with WBR on how AI is reshaping paid media for retailers. So today's conversation, I'm going to be joined by Drew and Nuno. So, gentlemen, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your backgrounds in retail. Nuno, let's start with yourself.
Oh, very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to join this webinar. I mean, I have been, to your point, working on retail for many years now, both on bricks and mortars as Parfois and Sona in Portugal, kind of large retailers focused on fashion and grocery, consumer electronics and fashion, and also working on some pure players as Farfetch. I was CIO at Farfetch, and at Vidressing, which is a C2C luxury model based in Paris several years ago. And recently, I was the digital COO at Dan Brown, looking for technology, but also for data and for operating models. So how to organize a company so that it's not only about leveraging technology, but also in terms of what you need to change in terms of people and processes and structures to be able to look after all these kind of superpowers and capabilities that you have available for people that you didn't have before. So this is me, and my pleasure to join.
I think you've got the right pedigrees for being having that conversation, particularly about what we're talking about here. Drew, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your background as well.
Yeah, hi both. So I'm Drew. I'm one of the co-founders of Up. My background is in data science and engineering. Haven't worked directly in the retailer, but for the last kind of 10 years, I've worked in SaaS businesses in the retail sector, from warehouse management systems and automation through to e-commerce websites and POS systems, and now into the media world, specializing in kind of AI.
Thank you. Cheers, Drew. So today I'm joined by Drew and Nuno, and in this session, we're going to share these key findings from some recent research we've done. We'll go into a bit of a discussion with Drew and Nuno about those insights and have their point of view on those, and then we'll close with some takeaways on that. Now, the insights we're going to explore today, they're not opinions from any particular individual. They're drawn from a survey of over 200 senior retailers and e-commerce leaders from across Europe. And it's the level of people that are giving us a credible picture of where that industry really stands on AI paid media or AI-led paid media. And there's three big themes that stood out, and we'll talk about these in more detail shortly. But just to go through those, first is that AI is now the backbone of retail paid media. What was once an experimental in betas with low adoption or even on the peripheral has become sort of the cornerstone of how retail digital media is run and through which demand is captured and how budgets flow. So it is absolutely core for the vast majority of retailers in Europe and the UK and broader than that as well. The second thing in the research is that the adoption of these AI-led media campaigns is high, but that success is not necessarily is quite uneven across the retailers when we spoke to them. So retailers are embracing campaign types and tools, but many are struggling to translate that adoption into consistent outcomes for their business. And finally, the third insight is that from what we see in the data, there's a real trust and also a readiness gap that exists. Leaders are still waiting whether their organization and their teams are ready to let go of control and whether they can fully trust AI to deliver against their commercial goals. The landscape we're going to delve into today, the reality behind the adoption headlines, the limits AI is holding it back, and the gaps that need closing before AI's full potential is realized. So let's start with the data behind those themes. And across our large sample, those 200 retailers, the annual paid media budgets total more than 11 billion. And almost 60% said they've increased the AI-driven media spend in the last 2 years. But retailers are no longer testing these AI-led campaigns. They are, as I said before, they're the commercial pillar of retail paid media and how they take their products and their offering and their brand to market. As I spoke about, the adoption doesn't automatically translate into the outcomes. 2/3 of retailers admit that they're running campaigns on incomplete data. We know that AI absolutely is fueled by data and the quality of data, and over half are struggling to scale spend across large assortments. That caps the growth and leaves, hidden winners within the retailer's range underfunded. And as I said, there's this trust gap. Only 10%, 10.5% of leaders are very comfortable letting AI manage their budgets end to end, and the vast majority, 86%, want proof, they want transparency, and they want the evidence of profitability before handing over greater control. So the spend is there, the adoption is there, but from what we're seeing, without the readiness and the trust, that full potential of these powerful AI-led systems isn't necessarily realized. And then once you accept that AI is already carrying that weight of retail spend, the next question is, what does that mean for the teams? So we hear, all the time that what is AI going to mean for people in any sector, really? But this is the world where most teams were built for execution. They're adjusting bids, they're reallocating budgets, pulling reports. But with 80% of retailers already using PMax and Google AI-led campaigns, 93% from our data using Meta's automated solutions, the levers have already moved to these AI machines, these AI-led campaigns. And on the right, the roles, the future roles, or those we're starting to see to take shape, certainly with the customers we're working with, are those for orchestration, shaping the data that the AI learns from, setting the right commercial objectives that it optimizes towards. So translating outputs into decisions that the wider business can act on, and critically aligning across trading, merchandising, and finance. So AI is driving business outcomes, not just campaign efficiency. And that's the real shift. It's from the execution to what we're seeing to the orchestration. Now let's talk about the readiness gap. I spoke about it as one of the core themes, and the research highlighted 3 ceilings that limit what AI can do. Firstly, data gaps. Almost 70% of the retailers only have partial data integration. Retailers are full of rich data, and AI can only optimize towards the signals it's given. And incomplete data inputs means that you've got, potentially incomplete outputs. Secondly, scaling struggles to be able to support the large inventories that retailers have. That leaves a lot of money on the table, because as a retailer, you want your range advertised when customers are holding up their hands and searching for your products. But what this data is saying is that those incremental winners, they're sort of left underfunded because they're not necessarily supported through the advertising. And third, vendor funding, a big thing now for retailers that are adopting marketplaces. That brings about complexity. And nearly 60% find it hard to align that co-op advertising or vendor promotions with AI-driven campaigns, adding another layer of friction in using these systems. So the problem isn't necessarily AI itself. The ceiling is the environment we sort of put it into, and what that means is that there's this readiness gap from what we see within the data. And then finally, you've got this trust gap alongside the readiness. There's this, certainly having worked in retail myself and on the agency side and now the tech side, it's kind of a cultural barrier, this trust element. Our data and from the research is saying that only 10% or so of retailers are fully comfortable giving AI complete budget control. Most want proof and transparency before letting go. So there's a lot of hesitancy in the market. And when you listen to how people describe this hesitation, it's not just about numbers, it's about the confidence. if I don't understand why AI is making these choices, how do I know it's right? We trust our trading instincts. A lot of retailers are built on this implicit knowledge that they have about what's happened before, and the machines sort of feel like a black box. And why is the system spending money over there? No, I would never have spent money in there, is what we hear. So even when adoption is high, like we see in the data, many leaders still question whether the machine knows better than years of trading experience. As I said, that inherent implicit knowledge that retailers have accrued over decades of trading experience, and that's the trust gap. Key here is also this part that we saw in some of the areas when we spoke to retailers, is this big shift that how success is measured. Measurement seems to be in transition. So for years, return on ad spend was the headline metric for digital marketing teams, and the focus the wider retail business had. And I think a lot of this stems from digital growing in plain sight and the channels around it increasing and establishing their importance, plus the marketing budgets that they command becoming larger lines on the marketing budget. But only 12%, 12.5% of leaders now rank ROAS as their top measure. Instead, there's 60 odd percent of prioritizing product range visibility, making sure the AI is surfacing that full assortment, or at least trying to get to that. And over half are now focusing on not just the transactional element of ROAS, they're now looking at other drivers such as customer acquisition to drive longer term growth. So ROAS hasn't disappeared, but it's no longer enough on its own. It's a measure of efficiency, not necessarily a measure of value. And retailers, retail leaders are broadening their frameworks to focus on profitability, incrementality, and customer growth, which is absolutely needed when you see figures such as £11 billion spent across our customer set that we surveyed in all of this. So, these are some of the key things we're seeing in the research. But also when you start to get to areas of trading such as peak, from my point of view, peak now spans pretty much the entirety of Q4. And that's where the gaps show up most clearly when you now have these systems being the backbone of what retailers do. You get budget bottlenecks where budgets are fixed or capped, and AI can't scale into demand even when the campaigns are profitable. You get data gaps. If signals are incomplete, AI misses out on opportunities to capture surges in demand for simple reasons such as budget or target capping, or poorly judged targeting changes that derail AI's learning. And then you have siloed teams when making trading and finance, they're not aligned, trading and finance and marketing, and AI outputs don't necessarily translate into expected commercial action. So when it comes to peak, it's not just about sales weeks. It really needs to stress test, or it does stress test and magnify every weakness of retailers having in their new marketing operating system, which now is an AI-led environment. So that's some of the key headlines, and I want to delve into this in a bit more detail from the people that know, the people that work with our customers and work on the retail side, and get into that research story. So we're going to now open it up, and I'll stop presenting here, so you can see Drew and Nuno in a bit more detail. And we're going to explore the findings in practice, and focus on this first theme, which is around the readiness and retail agility. And my question is first to you, Drew. The research shows that almost 70% of retailers only have that partial data integration into their media approach. So from a platform perspective, what does that look like in practice, and what does it cost them in terms of missed opportunity? What's the real world cost, in your view, by not having all of that rich, strong data from a retail point of view feeding into their AI media approaches?
Sure. So I think a lot of the trust gap around AI is really a symptom of this data loss. I think the two things I quite often see when talking to businesses and their understanding of AI, like we said, it's like you said in the presentation, the vast majority are adopting technologies like Performance Max, 80% there, but I still think we're at that kind of early majority adoption piece. if you think of it like an adoption curve, which really means that although we're utilizing the tools, I'm not sure that everyone's really got to grips with what that means in terms of how we work with the information. And I think data is one of the key parts. I think a couple of really big challenging parts. One, I think it's still really difficult for paid media teams to get hold of the data that's important and to then actually deploy the data into their systems. And most media teams I work with don't have a lot of control in terms of the data sources across retail businesses. They often have to kind of put it into engineering backlogs. Obviously, engineering have other priorities, so it kind of gets put on the list as a job to be done, and it kind of fits in when alongside other business priorities. So I think that is a really big challenge. I think the other thing as well that's kind of sometimes misleading is that you'll turn an AI system on and it will just work like magic. And maybe that's because of other AI tools like large language models, which are more kind of instant, that you put something in and you get a reaction from it. But actually, that's quite a good example. If you think about things like prompt writing, if you put a very basic prompt into a large language model, you get a very sometimes different and not what you thought response out of those systems, where if you put in a far more detailed thought through prompt, you get a far more concise response from those models. And I think this is very similar in these AI technologies, that I think sometimes the expectation is you're going to put on like a Meta Advantage Plus campaign type or Performance Max or demand gen campaign, and they're just going to work because it's AI. But the fact is, like any other AI technology, the model is only as good as the information it's receiving. So I think it's critical that focus is actually put on this data challenge. And I actually think that's the other limiting factor, is I don't actually think teams really spend that much time really working on that challenge. Like they kind of see it's important, but they kind of go, oh, it's too hard, so we'll just kind of work with what we've got. And that then leads to kind of old behaviors of old coming in, where people are kind of changing targets a lot and all those sort of things.
Okay, and actually, I think, Nuno, this is where your perspective is really key. You know, so you will have run those teams and managed digital and media operations yourself, and certainly from a CIO point of view, is it usually a technical challenge or a structural one? You know, what have you seen inside the retail organisations that slows down true data readiness in retail and where it's applied in AI, and in particular, what, you know, when it comes to the digital marketing world, if you've been close to that, what is it within an organization that's difficult from an operational point of view and slows down the readiness of a business?
Yeah, I believe that, to your point, is it structural or technical? I definitely say it's both. Because I'd say that when it comes to the technical part, to Drew's point, there is a lack of consistency between the data that you are able to get. So the data in most of cases is siloed. And even to your point about the adoption of Google PMax and Meta tools to drive automation and AI-driven marketing spend, those are, again, two different tools that are not integrated, that don't really give you an end-to-end perspective of the marketing spend, of the marketing return on investment that you do. What are the channels that you should be spending your marketing budget on? So this kind of data that is separate per channel, separate per tool, gives you a quite siloed and not integrated perspective of the money that you are spending and the return on investment that you should get, to your previous point, throughout different metrics that you should be able to put together. Even when you look at an e-commerce site, usually you have obviously the spend on Google, the spend on Meta, the spend on TikTok, but then you have things as the affiliate marketing spend that you do, the marketing partners that you use, the user reviews that you put in place, the product recommendation, the social proving tools. And if you look at it, all of them are usually managed in different tools and having, as a matter of fact, separate data lakes. And therefore, technically, it is pretty much a nightmare to bring all those kind of data source together and to have the right model to support that, no matter if it is at the attribution model level, at the econometric model level, or at a full marketing mix model level. So you really lack the ability to bring the data together technically, to integrate it, and then to provide a single view of reality to your teams, and obviously to show where you are spending the money and why you are spending money on that channel to different stakeholders on the business. So that I'd say it's a bit more technical, a bit structural.
Yeah.
But then also to your point, you have the structural challenge in terms of how do you have the right teams in place looking at the problem and trying to identify solution for it, or you have separate teams, separate marketing teams, technical team, digital product teams, UX teams, crawl teams, looking at each one of the part and working by their own. And that is where I believe that structural changes are needed at the company level, so that you move away from that siloed independent perspective into a cross-functional team perspective based ultimately on the outcomes that you want to achieve. If you are able to say for the company, this marketing mix spend and the return on investment that you do, and to your point, the category and the range visibility and the customer feedback and so on, being so important, you should say, how can I organize my people, my human capital inside my company, so that I enable them to focus on the outcomes that I want to get, but then they are having access to the end-to-end perspective of capabilities to deliver the value, and are able to tell these are the outcomes that together as a cross-functional team, not only marketing, not only tech, not only crew, not only UX, together we are able to get for our customers. So
Yeah.
part of it technical, part of it structural, definitely.
Well, and actually, from a readiness point of view, it rings true. Everything you're saying, it's not there yet when it comes to the readiness, which is what we see in the report. The other thing is around the trust and decision making. And you've been in those retail leadership roles, right, Nuno? And you've been signing off spend, you've been defending it to the board for investment in when you're trying to evolve a digital retail business, you're trying to evolve it. And so when it comes to the trust part, forgetting the readiness and the structural part, but the trust, what does it actually look like on the client side when you're in those meetings? What kind of proof or transparency do leaders such as yourself need before they'll let AI take more control, or take that leap into something completely new, such as what we do in the space around media management?
So as humans, I believe that most of the cases we tend to tell our story, and you don't like unhappy stories. You like to have happy stories to tell to other people, right? So you tend to change a little bit the story and to look at different drivers depending on the results that you are getting or on what you believe is the right thing to do. If you have this in mind, therefore, if you are on the other side of the table and you hear different stories or covering different topics this week, the past week, the previous month, and so on, then it's very difficult for you, as not being there every day, to understand what are the variables that you are touching, the impact that you are having, what are the different things that you might be able to change so that you create a different impact. So in my perspective, transparency is absolutely critical. So you should say, what are the metrics that are important for us? And then you stick to those metrics every day, every week, every month, and you are able to really see how the story is evolving in a very objective way. And I believe that this objective way, which is obviously based on data that you are able to trust, the story, the metrics over time that you are able to tell, and in retail, the like-for-like comparable periods, the different metrics are really important, not only in terms of visitors that I'm able to get to the site, or even per channel analysis or the overall channel analysis that I'm able to bring. It's really important to go a level down and understand by sub-channel, by each one of those models, whatever models you try to evolve, you are able to have a dashboard that shows the story and shows the impacts that you have. And in many cases on retail, as we know, obviously, it's not only the quality of traffic that you are bringing that has an impact in terms of the outcomes that you are getting, because the price, the promotion, the product availability, the campaigns that you have, what's happening with other competitors from you, all of that affects the conversion rate. All of that affects the revenues that you are able to get to the business. So this kind of model dashboard that are able to cover the different perspectives and then enable you to really focus on objective data and to see what are the evolution, in my perspective, is absolutely critical on an outcome-driven approach instead of metrics that I'm changing in an isolated and atomic level.
Yeah.
And I believe that to tell this story, it's really important to stick to that and then be able to commit to it. So stop finding reasons to undermine the model and say, okay, how can I support the model? And in many cases, I need to build it over time. So incubate, test, get the metrics and the outcomes, measure it, and go again on a continuous improvement loop and say, what are the things that were imperfect, that were incomplete, so that then we are able to iterate it over and over again.
Yeah. So Drew, you know, from your point of view, how do you see that trust gap manifesting in retail teams? You know, we had an interesting conversation this morning with the retailers. What's the best way to build confidence without constraining AI media's automation in the conversation we're having here and in something like Google's PMax? How do you start to reduce that trust gap? How do you see it manifesting in retailers from our side of the fence?
Well, I think this is really at the core, probably the biggest blocker for AI adoption at the moment. It really is at the kind of roots first principles issue that I see kind of going on in the market. But yes, AI adoption, like I said, I think we're kind of at that early majority. Now, why do we still see, I'd say 99% of businesses having to for better words, kind of day trade the AI systems? Those AI systems are, you know, they are incredibly smart, complex algorithms that actually everyone already knows in the industry, which is why you see that high adoption. It's better than the old ways of working. They are better than standard campaign management and day-to-day work. Like we kind of know that at heart, and most paid media teams are quite open with that. But yet what we see in contrast to that, and what's really conflicting, is this kind of habit out of necessity to constantly kind of try to course correct, which is really conflicting with the knowledge that we have. And why does that occur? It's very much to what Nuno was saying, is it's all about the metrics that matter. And I think that's actually what a lot of the retailers struggle with, is that we don't have in this sector, you don't have a data issue. So other sectors and other businesses, they struggle with actually data in terms of the ability to capture it. We have the reverse. We have so much data. However, it's in silos across departments, like we said. Some of those metrics as well, than the more traditional media metrics, especially in channel, as Nuno said as well, I think are very much vanity metrics, you know, impressions, click share, ultimately don't really matter anymore. And actually what businesses really need to get to the core of is, what is our North Star? Like, what do we actually care about? What does success look like? And I can see businesses understanding that, which is why I think that report says ROAS is kind of only, you know, what you said was less than 12% in terms of importance. I would slightly challenge that what I see in channel is people still obsessing with that number, but only because it's a lead metric that I think is rolling up to a CFO's C-suite metric of profitability. And because of that lack of understanding, I think, between commercial teams and the media teams, you see this kind of short-term ROI analysis going on, and the misunderstanding of the loss of opportunity around the long-term ROI. So what you start to see is that because we're not measuring truly focused on the core long-term metrics that matter, we're going for the in-day 24-hour behaviors that actually impact the long-term success. To do that, I think there are some quite big barriers to entry. Okay, so we all get that measurement is everything. I think everyone call would agree, and I think the market, when I talk about it, generally agree. So why isn't everyone doing it? If we all agree that this is the core thing that needs to now happen, why isn't everyone just adopting these metrics? And I think there's a couple of key reasons. One, I think actually the measurement frameworks are actually quite difficult to adopt and deploy. Two, there's a lack of education across the teams around what successful measurement is. And three, I think with the evolution of things like AI, actually the skill set and tool set has to also change within the marketing teams. You really need to get to grips with things like causal impact studies, media mix modeling, but also bring commercial teams along the journey, and fundamentally start to test these things in vain. And it is painful, but in the long term, we just know it just drives huge amounts of growth and actually puts you know, pillars above others that aren't doing those sort of things.
Yeah, and actually, what you're talking about there, and what Nuno was talking about earlier on about the organizational change element and skills. You know, for you, Nuno, when you think about restructuring teams for now and the future, and AI's impacts and the automation that comes with it, what change within retailers, within the digital marketing space, what happens when those people, processes, and critically the mindset, what happens over a longer period of time from your point of view?
This is a different kind of role that you need to play. And if you think it like that, you need to understand, I'm stop doing repetitive tasks that I repeat every day. I look at the tools every day and I take my own decisions. Two, I need to, first of all, interact correctly with those models and those tools, which is a different skill set that most of the people don't have. And to Drew's point, if you have been creating prompts, you know that depending on the prompt type that you create, you get much different results that might be much more accurate or much less accurate. So you need to understand how these new concepts work so that you move from doing the repetitive tasks over and over again to enabling and to validating what the models are doing so that you are able to understand and trust on them, to the previous point. So people need to upskill and to reskill. And again, if you say, I'm moving a level up instead of doing the things, I'm there to monitor, to measure what's happening, to check some of the results that I'm getting. It means that I need to, as if I have a team that does the work for me, I need to be able to interact with the model, the tool that does the work for me and takes the decision for me. So that definitely needs people to think different, to be ready to move a level up, still understanding a lot about the technical aspects of the tool or the process, but they need to move a level up. And therefore, I believe that over longer term, people will move more and more from operational specialists to strategic orchestrators, because AI will manage execution of it. I mean, in this case, things as the bidding, the optimization, personalization, but humans will keep on designing the brand narratives, the experiences, which means moving from a more technical administrative role to a broader role with higher insights to data science necessary and to human experience design. So on a personal and mindset perspective, we need to look at it as this kind of AI, agentic AI robots will be similar to other colleagues that I have on the organization chart. So it's just, instead of being a person, will be a robot doing the work for me and for the company. A robot that is very objective, that relies on objective metrics. It's not kind of influence in terms of perception. It relies on data. So I need to be able to understand that data really matters, and this kind of data decision points are really important. And then when I look at processes, obviously the first thing that is going to happen is kind of automating repetitive processes, and therefore I need to rely on data. I need to make sure that the data is governed, is trustable, it's rightly integrated. and that AI is also there to support experimentation. So in many cases, it's not a kind of a perfect result. I need to be open enough to evolve in a continuously loop process the outcomes that we have. And then on the longer term, I believe that more and more we'll have more and more algorithms taking decisions for us. So when it comes to dynamic pricing, dynamic promotion, dynamic content, and therefore having again the cross-functional teams focus on the orchestration in an end-to-end perspective will become probably in 2 to 3 years more and more important. So
Okay.
to your point, people need to change, processes need to change, and mindset inside the organization will need to change also.
And Drew, that sounds like your ideal workforce, right? You know, talking to robots that talk about data, and it sounds like your ideal world, maybe. But you know, we've spoken about execution and orchestration a long time in the past, and Nuno just spoke about it there. We're now talking about the shift in organizational change, and I'm key because we're early in the market, right, in terms of what we're doing. We don't see anyone else really like Up. So from your experience working with Upp's clients, what are the behaviors you're starting to see, or the habits, let's say, that define those teams that have really made that transition into a more modern way of thinking around AI and the successful teams in that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I'll probably talk about one of our customers, as we've just won an award with them on this very thing, B&Q. They're a great example. So we've worked with the B&Q team for a number of years, and I think both teams learned a lot along the way. But that team have gone through a real transition in their behaviors, skill sets, and learning, and kind of what they're focused on. Like when we first introduced our technology, it was a typical team, very much focused, I think, on the week-to-week behaviors, focusing on what campaigns were doing what, the intricacies of how these machines worked. Really obsessed as well around things like the black box nature of things like PMAX, which completely understandable, and I'd say a lot of businesses are still focused on. But they've kind of gone along a journey where they've been very, I would say, brave and also willing to challenge the status quo of not only adopting technologies like Up, but also willing to challenge the status quo of how they work internally and how those teams interact with one another. And they've, all credit to them as well, been very brave, I think, in challenging senior stakeholders around commercial teams and finance teams, which I think they would also agree they've still got a way to go, but they're definitely consistently knocking on those doors. And I think that really comes down to the fact that they've experimented with us. They've given us the bandwidth to kind of prove to them what our system can do. At the same time, I think quite a lot of people are worried that when AI does things like the kind of more deployment automation areas, that means, what am I going to do? Am I, have I not got a job anymore? And it couldn't be further from the truth. Like, actually, this opens up a whole new world of, I would say, far more high value work, far more interesting work, and rather than campaign management, one of strategy, and focus on business metrics that those actually, you're far closer to actually driving the business forward rather than doing that kind of treadmill work that Nuno talked about. So I think really that story is one of this B&Q are still going through that behavioral change. But what you can see in that team is that they've become very kind of focused actually on long-term metrics. So how can we become demand-led? What metrics actually matter to the business in terms of, is it profitability? Is it new customer acquisition? When we talk about things like inventory, actually they've kind of pushed back to their trading teams and said, we don't care so much about the type of inventory we're selling. We're caring about the types of inventory we sell based on those core metrics. And the interesting thing, you start to see things around like dashboards. When we talk about dashboards, which everyone in this space loves a dashboard. Sometimes I'll go and see a customer's dashboard and they've got 1,000 metrics on the thing, and you can't really tell what are we actually shooting at. It becomes really, really difficult to review. Whereas you look at B&Q, they've really simplified that view. Like, it's really kind of 3 key metrics. Yeah, they've got some kind of secondary things, but actually success is done over a long term, and they're forecasting what success looks like, thinking about things like seasonality. they've still got a way to go and they recognize that, but they're definitely a company that I've seen over the last 2 years really pushing the boundaries of, okay, we need to change because the world of e-commerce and AI is changing, the consumer experience is changing, but also our internal processes need to change, and we need to adopt the new technologies and work in a different way.
Okay, so I'm going to leap into the next theme here, and it's around commercial pressure and leadership, and actually just jumping off what you just said there around B&Q. You know, how can automation actually help leaders make better trade-offs between short-term performance and long-term profitability?
Well, I think the big elephant in the room that people don't talk about is that demand isn't constant. I think we have this kind of thinking sometimes, and I with enough understanding, especially this year, talking to a number of senior stakeholders, there's this idea that if last week wasn't as good as the previous week, that something's happened, and it means that demand has remained the same and a competitor has taken over, or we've done something wrong in our systems or whatever else, so we need to act now. And I think that's because retailers traditionally create media plans and media budgets, and the plan looks great on paper. It's just when it actually turns into the real world, that plan doesn't actually look anything like the real world. And so I think that the objective, and I think the part the CFO and C-suite team need to look at is, okay, commercially, what does success actually look like? What does that actually, in the long term, what does it look like? So without the detail of the plan, what is the long-term plan? What is that metric success framework? Are we going for profit, new customer acquisition, based on different, maybe regional programs? Are we launching in new areas? Do they need different success metrics? Think like that. And then start to work with the media teams on, okay, based on the technology that is in class today and how those technologies should be set up, how do we bring these two worlds together? And so I think there's a joint responsibility between the CMOs, head of paid media types, and the finance teams and the CFO to actually go, okay, let's bring our two worlds together. Let's bring the commercial requirements and the marketing capabilities and actually work out how do we bring the technology of today to meet our business needs, because that is possible. But what I often see is kind of a bastardization of the two. You've got the CFO saying, okay, this is our long-term vision, and the paid media teams or marketing teams having to work very strictly to like an in-day plan. And that doesn't work with the technologies.
Yeah. Okay. And Nuno, actually, you've operated in that space. You're at the C-suite level. When you were managing investment decisions under that kind of pressure then, that daily basis, how did you keep momentum up on the transformational part that we're now seeing? Think about the current climate. Does that make leaders more cautious around AI, or does it force them to adopt automation faster? Because the efficiency is sort of no longer optional anymore, to your point around, automating the mundane and repetitious stuff.
Yeah, the daily pressure is huge. And therefore, what I believe is, to your point, many times, even if you have the longer term strategy and outcomes that you want to achieve, if the daily sales are not to the level, you get so much under pressure that then you have many cases, all the structures, all the organization only trying to fix the short term. And by fixing the short term or trying to fix the short term, ultimately, you stop doing some of the very important things that will ensure that you are able to deliver on the longer term. So many of these things are really what happens all over the companies, I'd say. And retail is the ultimate challenge in terms of whatever is happening on the market, COVID, the war, consumer perception crisis, consumer confidence crisis, you feel it, Shein or Temu, you feel it immediately on your skin. And therefore, it really requires you to be very confident on the things that matter on the longer term, to be able to stick to the things in a longer term perspective. But I believe that as a leader, a C-suite leader, a retail leader, you cannot only focus on the short term. So usually when I organize my teams and companies' teams, I organize them in a way that I allocate capacity to the short term, the run part of the business, to the medium term, the kind of the growth part of the business, and to the longer term, what I call the transformation part of the business. So I believe that you need to understand that I cannot I can not only look at the longer term. I need to do things here and now. And many of those things were not planned last year because the market changed, and therefore I had to adapt. So this kind of quarterly review of priorities and quarterly review of the metrics and the value that you are delivering is really, really important. But you need still to dedicate focus and resources to the longer term part. So if you trust your vision, if you define the right outcomes on the longer term, and then if you enable your team to deliver it, your company to deliver it, you'll be able to measure it over the long term. And I believe that therefore the role of top leaders is absolutely critical. Top leaders are the ones that need to make sure that the vision and the resilience is there in terms of we know what we want to achieve, we know how we are going to measure the things that we want to achieve. We obviously are able to change the short-term movement to get to those outcomes, but we need to make sure that the North Star is there and you are able to achieve it over time. And therefore, to this point about does this affect the decisions and the ability to adopt automation, I believe that currently every CEO and every executive team is under a lot of pressure in terms of I need to do something AI related. I cannot go to the board or to the shareholder and say, no, this is not for me. I'm still managing my business every day the same way as I was doing it 2 years ago. So no one is able to afford it. But you need to learn, you need to get confidence on it. And therefore, I'd say that you need to incubate, you need to identify what matters, namely to our previous point in terms of data and integration. These things take time. And in many cases, the right infrastructure was not put in place 5 years ago. So we have a gap between where the state of the art and where we are and the needs and the ability to deliver. And you need to commit to those and to fix some of those infrastructure problems that we have, not as a big bang, but as a perspective about having the right vision and then delivering it step by step and delivering value and using use cases and incubating them and bringing teams and people with us on the journey day after day in a consistent and continuously learning process improvement.
Okay. So last section now, and these are the final two questions, one for each of you, and back to you, Nuno. You know, looking 2 or 3 years ahead now, how do you see AI changing the way that retailers trade and make decisions beyond media?
Definitely. I mean, there is no other way. I believe that I have been talking to people in terms of understanding what are the impacts that this has on the different end-to-end processes, on the different businesses. And definitely, I mean, pricing is absolutely a must-have. Obviously, that when it comes to pricing and promotion, you need to look at all the regulations that you need to follow, all the rules that you need to follow. But then the systems will be much more capable of defining when you have an assortment of hundreds of thousands of products. Is impossible for the human being to be able to measure and monitor each one of them. So systems will be able to do that. But again, if you look at what does it take to change pricing, it's not only the data and the model to tell you this is the price that I should be offering to my customer, to this customer now. You need to make sure that all the integration, all the pros or the data flows move from the engine that tells you the price to the e-commerce site that is able to change it, to the POS that is able to change it, and to the OMS that is able to process the order. So the kind of all the integration points that you need to put together are very complex. And again, to my previous point, is something that you need to start immediately so that you are able to get the value out of it. But again, as you had digital native players that really brought different rules to the market, I believe that we'll have AI native players soon in the market, and those ones will play with different tools and disrupt the way that we have it in place and all the legacy constraints that currently you face.
Okay, and finally to you, Drew, from what you're seeing across retail or retailers today, what are the early signs that this broader orchestration piece that we've been speaking about is already happening?
It definitely is happening. I think if you only go back a few years ago, people were really still trying to just generally challenge the use of AI in any capacity, really. I think, and we're definitely beyond that, and we are definitely seeing people's understanding and head towards technologies that can enhance the AI. So that is definitely happening. I think it's like any kind of evolution of technology. If you think around the .com or things like payment gateways, all of those sort of things. It's a lot of trial and error that will go through. And it will take a long time for it to become just commonplace. But if you look at the historical innovations that have gone on, going to the clouds, payment gateways, and everything else, what you find is the companies that really lent in heavily, like bothered to get the cuts and bruises first, they actually stayed ahead for the long term. Like it didn't mean that everyone catched up and it just turned into kind of a status quo. It actually meant that those businesses were heading towards the next level of things. And I think you're going to see the same again, that businesses that try it, get initial pain and go, oh, we're not going to do this, we're just going to go back to the old ways of working, they're going to really struggle. Whereas I think what you're starting to see is the businesses that are going, this is going to be really painful, but we're going to be brave and we're going to lean into it, and we're going to really put this as part of our projects for the next 24 months. They are going to ultimately win out and be more confident with the kind of battle scars that they go through.
Yeah, I think they're both great points to end on, and a kind of a reminder that every major shift in retail sort of starts with this mix of optimism and uncertainty. And I think what matters and what you're both articulating is how quickly organizations turn that sort of discomfort and the cuts and the bruises into progress. So, we're going to end there now, and I want to thank you both, Drew and Nuno, for your time and your perspectives. It's been really invaluable to get your view on things. Now, what we do have here is the research that we've been talking about. Just bear with me a minute. If you can see that on the screen, this is what we talked about. It's the AI readiness report. It's available to download now. So if you click on the screen now, that's or if you scan the QR code, that's going to take you to the report. It goes deeper into the data that we've covered today, including where retailers sit on the maturity curve and how most advanced are closing the readiness gap and the trust gaps we see. So you can download the link on the screen. And thanks again for joining us. And thank you again to Drew and Nuno for their thoughts and time on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.